Hello, today I want to tell you the story about Richard Zorge, the unsung hero of the 20th century that changed the course of history, and not only once but twice actually. So here we can see he was proclaimed the hero of the Soviet Union, although after his death he received that reward. And he is the most famous as a guy that informed Stalin about the fact that the Japanese Empire is not going to attack him in 1941. The Japanese at the time were more interested in attacking the United States and French colonies and other things. And because of it, Stalin is able to send his troops he held in the east to Moscow, and precisely at the right time the tide of war is turned in favor of the Soviets, and Zhukov wins against the Germans. And in the conventional interpretation of history, it is a Battle of Moscow. The Battle of Moscow is the battle that changes the course of the World War II, and it ultimately leads to the Soviet victory. And I believe that most people today would agree with me that in that aspect, Richard Zorge changed the world for the better, and that he is a hero. And he was, after all, shot by the Japanese in 1944. That is when he was discovered as a Soviet spy. But Zorge, as I already mentioned, actually changed history in a very significant way, even before what he did in 1941. But he changed it in a way in which it isn't so clear whether he changed it for the better or for worse. But I ultimately still believe that he changed the course of history for the better. Okay, but let's start from the beginning. Who was Richard Zorge? So, or Richard Zorge, as the Germans would say. So he is born in the suburbs of Baku, in the Russian Empire in 1895. He's born to a German father and to a Russian mother. His father is a German engineer and a German ultra-nationalist and an imperialist, as he later himself called his father after he became a communist. Here we can see Richard Zorge's house in today's Azerbaijan. But in 1914 he's sent to serve in the Great War, and on the battlefield the experiences he has on the battlefield, they would ultimately change him as a person. He is hit by a shrapnel from a grenade, and he loses 3 of his fingers, and he develops a lifelong limp. And he probably also develops some form of post-traumatic stress disorder, and ultimately the traumatic experiences that haunt him lead to him concluding that World War I was meaningless and that nationalism itself is meaningless, and he becomes a leftist, a socialist at first. He joins the Independent Socialist Democratic Party of Germany. This is their symbol, and they call themselves independent because they are against the war, while the socialists at the time weren't actually against the war. And he's also influenced by the sailors' mutiny in Kiel that actually starts the German Revolution after the Kaiser. And very soon he comes under the influence of his father-in-law, and his father-in-law is a Marxist. And because of his life experiences and because of his father-in-law, he joins the German Communist Party. And because of it, he ultimately loses his job as a teacher, and he decides to become a Soviet spy. And in the 1920s, in the crazy, turbulent years of the 1920s, he is first sent in Great Britain to assess the possibility of a communist revolution in Great Britain. And he is actually almost killed because he was proclaimed to be a follower of Bukharin. Bukharin, he's this guy. He was, let's say, he disagreed with Stalin about some important issues, which is why Bukharin gets killed. And our hero, our main hero of this story, is also almost killed because he liked Bukharin, but somehow he survived. And after the time he spends in Great Britain, he's sent to join the Nazi party. And for a while, he is a member of a Nazi party in Germany in 1929, just as they were becoming more and more popular. He joins them because the communists gain interest in what Hitler is doing, and they want to know more about this new, relatively speaking, new political party in Germany that ultimately comes to power and starts World War II. But immediately after he joins the Nazis, he's sent on a far more bizarre mission. In 1930, he goes to Shanghai. And while all this crazy stuff is happening in Europe, China is experiencing one of the bloodiest wars in human history. And I'm, of course, talking about the war of Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek, the war between the Chinese communists and the Chinese nationalists. And the war essentially started in 1927, and it lasts until 1949. And the Japanese attack, of course, and make the entire affair even bloodier. But yeah, at this time, Reinhard Zoge is sent to join the Chinese nationalists, and at the time, the Weimar Republic, as many other states, sent their military advisors to Chiang Kai-shek. And this is actually how China looked in 1931. Here we can see the pockets of communist resistance. At the time, the Mao Zedong army, the largest communist army in China, and as the name tells you, it's the army that's led by Mao Zedong. That's why it's called the Mao Zedong army. Has 40,000 men. And at the time, Reinhard Zorge is trying to get information from German military experts that advise Chiang Kai-shek, and he actually manages to seduce a wife of a German military expert, and she, for whatever reason, didn't like her husband, and she has an affair with this Soviet spy, and she tells him military information, classified military information about what is Chiang Kai-shek about to do. And turns out that information actually changes the course of the 20th century history, at least if we are to believe Jung Chang. And he is the author of the book called Mao, the Unknown Story, and I definitely recommend this book to all of you. The point of the book is to explore and to explain some myths that are still very strong in China today about Mao Zedong. And for example, he mentions that this idea that in the early stage of the war, that even then Mao was a military genius, he argues it is simply not true, and many people in China and probably even in the West, they don't know that the first great military victory of Mao Zedong that actually made him famous and that made kind of Moscow and even the Chinese Communist Party kind of secure in their decision that Mao should be the Chinese Communist leader, well, that first victory isn't won because Mao is a military genius, but it is won because of our main protagonist, and that is Richard Zorge. And he actually tells Mao exactly when and where Chiang Kai-shek plans on attacking. And at this point, we are truly talking about a war of two evils. On the one hand, Mao is in the process of killing his own men. In 1931, the author of the book, Jung Chang, calls it Stalin's purges before Stalin's purges. So Mao kills 25% of his men because he's obsessed with fighting the the kulaks, as he calls them, or just traitors. He is obsessed with torturing people and then killing the people that are allegedly working for the anti-revolutionary elements, and he actually manages to kill 25% of his men, and there probably would have been a mutiny, a rebellion against Mao, because the troops strongly disliked Mao's behavior, and Jung Chang argues that Zhu probably would have killed Mao and replaced him, but precisely at the right time for Mao, Chiang Kai-shek decides to attack. And that event is in the Chinese history, or at least in the Chinese Communist history, is known as the first conquest of destruction. And that's how they called Chiang Kai-shek's attempts at extinguishing and annihilating the communists in the early stages of the war. And the first conquest of destruction is probably the most important one. Well, one of the most important one, because in the early stage, as I already mentioned, Mao wasn't a military genius, and he lacked experience that later helped him become a military genius. And the communists, well, the communists really could have been destroyed at this point. We are talking about 40,000 men and some other small pockets of resistance that weren't so important, and even more importantly, weren't so united, and therefore they weren't so strong as the Mao Zedong army, the largest communist army that existed in China at that point. And I actually agree with the author of the book, Mao the Unknown Story, that at that point, had the Mao Zedong army been destroyed, it probably would have meant the end of communism in China. But the Mao Zedong army isn't destroyed. And yeah, and what I also need to mention is, while Mao was killing his own men, well, what did the white armies do? Well, their allies, the warlords, in 1929, they caused the Great Northwestern Famine and kill 6 million Chinese peasants. And why do they do it? Well, they do it because they're greedy. The warlords, they force peasants to grow opium instead of food. And like, what a surprise, peasants then don't have enough food and they die. And also there is a drought, but actually the Great Northwestern Famine is a great example of how unregulated capitalism can also lead to famines. But okay, obviously Maoism also led to huge famines, as most of you already know. But okay, let's return back to what's happening. So essentially we have at this point, in my opinion, two evils fighting each other. And Mao Zedong hides in the forests, in the amber forests of China, and watches the battle from the misty mountains. And because Richard Zorge informed him, his army is actually capable of ambushing a far more technologically and numerically superior enemy, and Chiang Kai-shek's first army is annihilated, and because of it the communists are able to capture enough ammunition and weapons to fight off the other armies that are sent by the enemy, and also the communist morale after the first conquest is very high and the enemy morale is very low, which is also important for the history of China. And what happens after this is, to me, it's like a scene from a movie. Yeah, the communists are victorious. We can see them celebrating on this hill, but the main leader of the first anti-communist army, he's captured alive, and then he's beheaded, and his head is put on a raft and sent down the river to Chiang Kai-shek, and on the raft there is a white flag with a message, a gift for the General Chiang Kai-shek, and the head is sent to float down the river. And we don't actually know if the head actually reached Chiang Kai-shek, but yeah, they sent a human head to float down the river. And yeah, I just imagine a Chinese child fishing with his father, and then they see this fucking head on the on the raft. And yeah, but those were truly brutal times. But just as the Chiang Kai-shek actually lost his temper after the second conquest of annihilation was also stopped by Mao Zedong, who at this point was stronger because he captured the munition from his enemies and their guns and their artillery and radio equipment. Well, just as he's about to destroy communists with 300,000 of his men, the Imperial Japan attacks, and Chiang Kai-shek is forced to withdraw his troops, and ultimately, because of it, Mao Zedong is saved, and he proclaims the first Chinese Soviet state. And as we know, in the end, the communists actually win. But yeah, and I would argue that while it isn't clear whether or not communists did more good than bad, what is apparent is that Richard Zorge changed the course of 20th century history. And while on the one hand, Mao did kill millions of his own people, maybe even 100 million, but on the other hand, because China became communist, the European colonial powers lost their presence in China and later in Vietnam. So maybe the victory of the Mao Zedong army in the end even did more good than bad, but that remains to be discussed. And tell me in the comments, what do you think? Did Zorge do more good or bad by saving Mao Zedong?